Robby, what is on your radar?
Now, a lot of foreign policy to go over today. We're going to start with Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was in Washington, D.C. on Friday, but came away empty-handed as President Donald Trump declined to promise that the U.S. would supply Ukraine with Tomahawk missiles. And let's be clear, Trump was absolutely right to do so. Now, while Russian President Vladimir Putin is exhibiting concerning signs that he will not agree to peace with Ukraine at all and wants to conquer the entire country, we simply cannot take the most extreme option until we are absolutely certain that peace is not on the table. So let me say that once again. Trump is right about this, and Trump is proving that he is the peace president. He's proving that with the Middle East, which we will turn to later during the show. And he's trying to prove it with Russia-Ukraine as well. His instincts to wage peace rather than war are morally correct and politically popular, and represent a refreshing break from the bipartisan foreign policy consensus. As someone with Trump's instincts had been leading the U.S. in the 90s, the aughts, and the 2010s, as America accrued foreign policy blunder after foreign policy blunder, and actually created the conditions for Putin's horrific invasion of Ukraine, well, maybe we wouldn't be in this mess. But we are in this mess, and now the question is, what should we do about it? Trump has engaged in Herculean negotiating efforts to bring Zelensky and Putin to the table. His efforts have worked on Zelensky, who now has a far more realistic outlook about the likely end of the war, a negotiated settlement. The Biden administration, unfortunately, had convinced the Ukrainian government that U.S. support would be unlimited and that we would defend every inch of Ukrainian territory from Russian invasion. This was, of course, completely absurd. It was always the case that the Ukrainians did not have a plan to eject Russia from their land entirely. Neither Zelensky's military advisors nor U.S. military advisors thought this outcome likely at all. All along, the plan should have been to defend Ukraine, yes, but get a peace deal on the table, one that probably wasn't going to be ideal for Ukraine, the weaker party, but would leave the rest of the country intact. Now, Trump has gotten Zelensky there, which is good. But Putin has proven to be extremely stubborn, and despite appearing to favor negotiations and peace talks, he keeps delaying the actual end of the war, which does raise the unfortunate possibility that he's really not interested in peace at all. He wants to take the rest of Ukraine. And if that's how it's going to be, then that's how it's going to be. And there's no reason not to sell Ukraine weapons and the means to defend themselves. Russia wants a war, they'll get a war. But I, for one, still think we should make one last effort to avoid that outcome. Because Tomahawk missiles, which would theoretically allow Ukraine to hit targets within Russia, that runs the risk of drawing the U.S. directly into this conflict. What if Russia perceives a Ukrainian attack on the homeland, an attack managed with U.S. weapons, as an act of war on the part of the U.S.? Do we really want to be at war with Russia over the fate of a nation we have no special obligation to defend? Of course not. That's why Trump was right to ultimately call off plans to provide the Tomahawk missiles to Zelensky. In a long and apparently tough meeting on Friday, Trump informed Zelensky he wasn't ready to provide the weapons just yet and wants to wait to meet with Putin in the next 2 weeks, likely in Budapest, Hungary. That stance is tough but smart. Here was Trump addressing the matter in an interview with Fox News over the weekend.
We can't give all of our weapons to Ukraine. We just can't do that. And I've been very good to President Zelensky and to Ukraine, but we can't give, if we're going to be short, I don't want to do that. I can't jeopardize the United States.
You're correct, Mr. President. If we are going to arm Ukraine with Tomahawk missiles, we have to be absolutely certain that peace is not something Russia is interested in. President Putin, the ball is now in your court. You should accept the peace deal that ends this war and commit to engaging in no further aggression against Ukrainian territory that remains in Ukrainian hands. And if he is unwilling to do that, then you will see a very different side of the U.S. and of Trump. We want peace, but if we can't have peace because of your obstinacy, then okay, you're going to get escalation and you're going to get war. Before it comes to that, take the deal.
Well, I agree with some of that, and some elements we have differences on. Look, I think the fundamental difference we have is that I believe more strongly than you do that the US does have vital interests at stake here, in the sense of deterring Russia from further aggression toward its neighbours or expanding its power. In relation to the Tomahawk missiles. I would argue that he should actually have provided the Tomahawks, because the dynamic that you, I think, correctly outlined, where Putin is reluctant to make peace, is partly because Putin sees time as being on his side. And the longer it goes on, the more he can roll through, the more American support for Ukraine will weaken, the more even perhaps European support for Ukraine will weaken. So therefore, you have to change a dynamic, to my mind, where Putin simply plays for time or believes time's on his side. And the Tomahawks would be one way of doing that. I do take the point that there is a danger of escalation. I think that's obviously the downside to it. But you have to do something to stop a pattern of defeatism, really, where the US is just like, well, we can't really afford to do this forever, so would you like to make peace, Mr. Putin? And Mr. Putin realizes that he doesn't have to make peace. He can just keep going so long as the US desire to help Ukraine gets more and more depleted.
I am just so concerned about taking that step with the missiles that I want to give it one more shot. You have part of Ukraine. It's not really on the table for that to be returned. We got Zelensky to begrudgingly concede that there's going to be a territorial concession. This is the best deal I think Ukraine can possibly get, and Putin should take it. And if he doesn't take it in this next meeting, if we really don't have any significant drawdown in the fighting, then yes, we should give them the missiles. I agree. I just don't want to do it, not that we're doing it in a hasty way, but the danger of escalation is very real. These weapons could allow that Ukraine is enthusiastic about the prospect of hitting Russian targets inside Russia to change the calculus. And I hear you about delaying, but another 2 weeks is not going to fundamentally alter the trajectory of the war. So let's have one more meeting where Trump is polite but tough and firm with Putin that if they really give us no choice, then we're going to supply the Ukrainian defense. Mm-hmm. If it's really they want to take the whole country, then they're going to have to fight for it, and it's going to be horrific and bloody, and thousands more Ukrainians will die and Russians. So one hopes that cooler heads will just prevail and Putin will decide not to go that route, because we are going to make it more costly for him.
Well, I hope we are if it comes to that. I think that level of firmness or strength that you're hoping to see from Trump isn't something that I think he has shown in face-to-face discussions or talks with Putin, including in Alaska, where I think Putin clearly emerged as the sort of strategic or moral victor of that, because he got what he wanted, the pomp and ceremony, without making any concrete concessions.
Well, he's going to get missiles soon if there isn't more movement on the peace front.
Well, Robby, let's get started. What is on your radar?
Well, remember Jack Dorsey? He was the founder of Twitter, but he exited the company well before Elon Musk took over the social media site and renamed it X. Back in the day, Jack came under furious attack from conservatives owing to the perception that his very liberal site was aggressively censoring the right's speech. Of course, what we didn't quite know at the time was that Twitter faced tremendous pressure from government agencies to moderate content, and that even liberal Twitter employees were privately uncomfortable about what the government wanted them to do. The problem wasn't the site's moderators or Jack Dorsey, the problem was jawboning. Well, in the years since Twitter became X and became a very, very different place, Jack Dorsey's kept, I would say, a relatively lower political profile, but he does resurface from time to time, and yesterday, he made quite a bold political statement. Thomas Massie for president. Now, Representative Thomas Massie, I'm sure most of you know, is a libertarian-inclined Republican who has occasionally clashed with President Trump because he doesn't just support America First. Massie actually votes to implement America First. Imagine that. Makes him different than most other elected Republicans who often do not stick to that principle. Massie, you may know, has continued to pursue Jeffrey Epstein disclosures, even as many other prominent Republicans have lost interest in promoting the kind of transparency that they vowed to foster if they ever return to power. Massie's also skeptical of the U.S. getting dragged into foreign conflicts, whether it's with Iran or Venezuela. And he knows that the administration claiming for itself vast new powers to issue tariffs is going to hurt working people and small businesses. Now, in other words, He's my kind of Republican. He's not an unthinking partisan. He doesn't reflexively side with or against Trump. He has an ideological core that matches our founders: limited government, free markets, and civil liberties. It's too bad he's not running for president. In his response to Dorsey, he wrote on X, "I doubt I'll run for POTUS, but I appreciate the support, Jack. I'd be happy if we could get just 4 or 5 more voices in Congress who don't always just do what their party tells them." Wouldn't that be nice? Right now, it's pretty much just Massey and Marjorie Taylor Greene in the House, and Rand Paul, of course, in the Senate. Paul, by the way, had a perfect explanation for why he doesn't support either the Republican plan or the Democratic plan to fund the government. Let's watch.
The way I look at these votes is they're determining the spending level. So the legislation doesn't say, do you want to keep government closed or keep it open? Both parties, when they're in power and the roles change, are guilty of saying, oh, you want to shut the government down. Even though I'm not with the Democrats, I didn't vote for their Democrat spending bill, and I didn't vote for the Republican spending bill. I did so because the spending levels lead to an enormous amount of deficit.
But of course, independent thinkers like Paul and Massey aren't being celebrated for their fealty to principle. They're under attack. Massey, in particular, has attracted Trump's ire. The president even endorsed a primary challenger to Massey, despite the fact that that challenger has yet to enter the race. And of course, AIPAC has targeted Massey and is spending money against him for the crime of believing that America first means putting America first, not a foreign country first, not Israel first. Massey opposes giving financial aid to that country, a country with a lower debt-to-GDP ratio than our own. How dare he? The attacks on these three, Massey, Paul, and Marjorie Taylor Greene, just go to show that there's really no reward for consistency in Washington, D.C. The swamp is eager to sublimate heterodox politicians and force them to bow to the Democratic establishment or even the Republican establishment. Trust me, there is one. As for me, I'm with Jack.
Excellent stuff, Robbie. I agree that it is that the establishments in both parties create this kind of centrifugal force in DC that pulls people into sorts of like unpleasant and overly neat positions. And I can't remember exactly the phrase you used, sublimating heterodox politicians. I think that's true, and I think more heterodoxy would be a good thing, whether it's in politics, in the media, or anything else. As far as Thomas Massey is concerned, there are some things I agree with him on and some things I disagree with him on. I'm sure he's completely unbothered about that either way, and that's fine. I think he does show some sort of loyalty or fealty to his own principles, and I think that's a good thing. Jack Dorsey, I mean, obviously I know who he is, and I remember him as the proprietor of Twitter, as it then was.
He's actually a libertarian of sorts,
That's what
which
I
was
thought,
confusing because the site was so liberal when he was running it, and there was so much censorship isn't exactly the right moderation that was, well, then it was censorship when we found out the government was pushing for it. We didn't know that at the time. So he really got attacked. And it flipped for me when I would see him hauled before Congress, just like Zuckerberg. And I'm like, oh, like, these people have no idea what they're talking about. The people asking him questions on both sides. You know, the elderly questioning young people about, why doesn't my cell phone load?
Right.
Ugh.
Right. No, I take that point. I think I'm more open than perhaps you are to tech CEOs getting, tough questioning. I take your point that sometimes it would be like Chuck Grassley or whoever, somebody who's not probably the most tech-savvy person in the world asking questions that don't appear to make much sense. I do think that, obviously tech companies are enormously powerful players, not just economically, but in our society. And so I think it's very valid to ask them, tough questions. But in relation to Dorsey, do you see this endorsement of Massey as him dipping his toe back into politics more generally, or do we not really know one way or another?
I don't know. Maybe he just does a lot of drugs or something.
Maybe he's just really a big Thomas Massey fan and no one else.
And just expressed it. I mean, I hope so, because I have started to worry that Massey is coming under very serious attack from the president, and perhaps he would have a well-funded challenger. And Trump is very good at flipping everyone to be in the Republican coalition to be on his side, even when it's, this is not the same as like an Adam Kinzinger or whoever who was a Bush Republican and hates Trump, and this is not personal. And Rand Paul always says, I have nothing against him. I like the president. He's my favorite president of my lifetime. I just don't always agree with him. And we've so eroded the space for that. Yeah. To your point about heterodoxy, this is just not. I'm really maybe to a fault, a stickler for the vision of the founders. Mm-hmm. This is just so not what they intended, was when they designed the bodies of our government, when they designed Congress, they did not picture political parties. Right. They were against political parties. It was George Washington's final warning not to start them. They thought, they were concerned about regional interests. So they thought that, sometimes Virginia and New York would agree on something and Tennessee and whatever. Like, that was their thinking, not that the Republican Party will march in lockstep with a few more interesting dissenters, and so will the Democratic Party, and it will just be a force of will between whoever has more representation. It's just not what they pictured. Well, our system was not designed for it.
Right, which is, of course, why it then gums up the whole system when that happens. If you can depend on a block of either party voting adamantly for against each other, then it just nothing happens, because there are protections built in that don't have that model in mind.
Right. When you play, I know this from playing board games, from playing Agricola. One of my favorite board games is a farming game, which you can play with 2, 3, 4, or 5 players. When you play with 3, 4, or 5 players, you would never make a suboptimal move to harm someone else, because then the third or fourth player are the beneficiaries of that. You hurt someone and you hurt yourself. Right. There's more room for, on the contrary, there's room for collusion with another player to your mutual benefit. When you play with just 2 people, well, then you do make a suboptimal move to hurt the other person, because there's no third-party beneficiary. Right. So then it's just trying to screw each other constantly. That's what our politics is. It should be 5-person Agricola, but it's only 2-person Agricola.
I like this analogy, Robby. This segment was not brought to you by, what's it called again? Agricola?
Agricola.
We're not doing this because we're endorsed by your board game.
Big Agricola. It's a great game. Now to get to my radar.
That is true, Robby. Yes, I missed your cue for it, but please do tell us what is on your radar.
Let's get there. All right. Of all the things to get really, really mad at President Donald Trump about, Democrats are going with White House renovations. Yes, the president's decision to add a ballroom to the White House is actually being met with significant fury by liberals and Democrats now that the construction is actually underway. An image of the White House being remodeled, which did necessitate a partial demolition of the East Wing's facade, went viral on X yesterday, prompting a great many meltdowns. Senator Elizabeth Warren wrote on X, "This is Trump's presidency in a single photo. Illegal, destructive, and not helping you." Well-known liberal social media personality Ron Filkowski wrote, "This is a desecration and an abomination." First, he posted an AI video of himself wearing a crown, dumping excrement on the heads of Americans. Then he starts tearing down part of the White House for his Mar-a-Lago-style ballroom. Hillary Clinton got in on the game, writing, "It's not his house, it's your house, and he's destroying it." Hillary's outrage is particularly ironic because, as the journalist Selena Zito pointed out, every president makes changes to the decor and even the structure of the White House, and the Clintons were no different. Yes, it's true that the addition of the ballroom is more significant than anything Bill Clinton did, and it's also true that it has required a bit of demolition, but the part of the White House being demolished is the East Wing's facade, which wasn't even part of the original structure, and is being cleared away so that the White House can have a ballroom, which is a perfectly legitimate and, some have argued, necessary improvement. The president obviously would like to host larger events and currently has no means to do so. If a future president doesn't like the style of the ballroom, well, they can change it. It happens. In fact, let's have a little history lesson. Teddy Roosevelt expanded and renovated the White House in 1902. FDR added a second story and a basement during his presidency in the 1930s. Then from 49 to 52, Harry Truman comprehensively remodeled the White House, dismantling and rebuilding the interior entirely. It's a whole new building. Then the building, because of that renovation, had actually lost much of its architectural flavor at that point. And so when John F. Kennedy came to the presidency, First Lady Jackie Kennedy engaged in an extensive restoration process that made it fit the style of the earlier presidents. Subsequent presidents have refurbished the first family's living quarters. Richard Nixon even added a bowling lane, of all things, in that spirit. Trump is adding to the grandeur of the White House. He's not destroying it. He's making room for larger state dinners, which currently have to sharply limit guests or serve people under tents outdoors. Best of all, private donations are paying for the renovation, not the taxpayers. That seems like a good deal to me. And say what you will about Trump, but one thing the voters seem to like about him is that he values a good deal when it comes to real estate. I'm interested to see what your take is, Niall. I was kind of thrown by this one. The volume of the liberal hysterics and shrieking took me by surprise. It's not bulldozing the White House. They're adding on to it. There's a little bit of knocking something down. It's not very much of the building. What am I missing?
Well, let me first pick up on your historical thread, because I feel obligated to point out that the original architect of the White House was born in Ireland. A man by the name of James Hoban, who was born in Kilkenny, Ireland. So let's give him his props.
Fantastic.
Secondly, I largely agree with you that some of the outrage about this is rather overdone. Because, look, I mean, I'm critical of Trump for lots of reasons. I'll be critical about something else he's done later in this show. But I do think that people like myself who have criticisms need to sort of prioritize what those criticisms are. And a renovation of the White House seems to run pretty low among them. I do take... Like some of the guy who, the kind of digital guy who said it was an abomination, Philip Kowski, like I don't have much time for that. I did think Elizabeth Warren to me was sort of getting at this thing of using the photos of the destruction almost as a kind of metaphor for what the Trump presidency is doing.
Okay.
And that I can accept more easily. It does go to the power of the image. I mean, not to get us down too much of a tangent, but I think back to, do you remember the photo of George W. Bush as president flying over New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina? And he was looking out the window. Now, I think his response to Katrina was way lacking, but there was this criticism of the photo that he was looking sort of impassive or whatever. It's like, what's he supposed to do? He's supposed to be like crying and, you know, rending his garments or something. Like, the photo was the photo, but it came to encapsulate a broader lack of care or response to Hurricane Katrina.
Those kinds of projections that people do are always so
suspect.
Silly.
I think that it is, that stuff is tricky.
And I would not defend every single renovation. Like the Truman one was not good because now they had to do it because the building had no longer become functional. It had basically been tweaked so many different times that the entire structure was unsound. So they had to rebuild it from the inside. But when they did that, it was no longer sort of in keeping with the Greco-Roman or French influences of the founder's vision. And so then Jackie Kennedy did this very famous and very successful remodeling, refurbishing to have it more in the style of what Jefferson and Madison would have intended, that's a good thing.
Right.
I'm for that. Obviously, I'm for the fact that Truman had to remodel it because it was going to collapse.
Sure.
If Trump, installed like
a glowing neon Trump sign above the top,
Cannon kind of Back to the Future Part 2 changes to it, I would be against them. But this is really mostly just adding on to the structure.
Right. And I have to say, having been in the East Room of the White House quite a few times, it is relatively small for the biggest room in the White House. You know, for those kind of events, it's pretty cramped. So I don't really object to the purpose so long as it's executed with some measure of taste.
It doesn't look like it does on our screen.
No, it doesn't.
These buildings are all next to each other.
Exactly.
The White House does not lead into, what was that, the Lincoln? The White House and the Lincoln and the
Capitol and the Supreme Court and all that.
Got the actual thing on camera. That's how it looks.
Much nicer. I'm not sure about that flagpole, but it's fine.
Oh yeah, you can see the crane. Yeah. I'm just amazed that they're proceeding so swiftly with this. Construction seems to take forever in any other context.
I mean,
you can waive whatever zoning.
I guess it's
in your way.
High priority job. I would imagine.
They have a neighbor saying, filing complaints.
Not in my backyard.
With the district saying, this will cast a shadow on my lawn. My rights are being violated. I must thwart this at all times.
Rob in the Treasury Department of Daylight.
Yeah, I've told you that was a really formative experience for me in Ann Arbor as a college student at the University of Michigan. seeing these, the most liberal, one of the most liberal towns in America, these super liberal but affluent, mostly white people who live in the city of Ann Arbor, fighting with the most not conservative ideologically, but just conservative by disposition, fighting every single new building and a single attempt to add height, to add more housing for the students.
There'll be none of that.
Right.
Preserve the original style.
Yes.
That's how it goes.
Robby, what is on your radar?
Well, Karine Jean-Pierre, the former White House press secretary, is participating in a media tour to promote her new book, Independent, a look inside a broken White House outside the party lines. But her numerous appearances with otherwise ideologically friendly interviewers, Stephen Colbert, Tim Miller, Gayle King, have not gone well for a very specific reason. She has no satisfying answer to the question on everyone's minds. That question, which has rightly been put to her every single time she appears on television, is something like this: how could you not have known the president was in such bad shape? When King asked her version of the question, Jean-Pierre responded thusly.
I was his White House press secretary, which means I had a role that saw him practically every day and traveled with him.
And you saw nothing.
For more than 95%. We've always said, we're not going to say, oh, he didn't age. He aged. And he poked fun at it. We always owned up. And with age comes what happens when you get older.
Which is?
But when we talk about the mental acuity, and again, I take this very, very seriously.
Yeah.
I never saw anyone who wasn't there. I saw someone who was always engaged. I saw someone who understood policy, pushed us on the policy, and also understood history.
Someone who was always there. Well, for Colbert, Jean-Pierre conceded that Biden's June debate performance was disappointing, but maintained that she had always seen the president in complete command of his faculties.
I saw every day a really ugly assault on someone who had 50 plus years of experience and who, again, objectively had done a good job as president of the United States. And it was heartbreaking to see that type of behavior.
I think all of that, everything you're saying, I cannot fault the factual basis of what you're saying or your feelings about it.
And then
What happened was the debate performance. Everything is downstream of that.
And no one is saying that the debate performance wasn't shocking, wasn't a disappointment. No one is saying that.
Disappointment is such a light term.
And then, with Tim Miller, Jean-Pierre demurred and admitted she could not speak to whether Biden was well enough to serve as president until 2028.
Like, the notion that this person was up for being president to 2028, was up for the communications responsibility of this job and fighting. No, well, if he won again, he would have to have been president all the way till 2028. I think that's an absurd thing to suggest that he could have been president. Do you think he could have been president in 2028?
I can't speak to that. Here's what I.
Well, obviously, no. But so was he up for it though? I guess. I just big like he didn't have the vigor for this fight.
Let me. We have to rewind the tape a little bit and not be revisionist historians here.
Seriously, why is KJP even putting herself through this? It's humiliating. The uncomfortable and unavoidable fact of the matter is that the news media, conservative and mainstream, had already taken notice of Biden's diminished mental acuity well before the debate. A majority of the American people had noticed it. A majority of Democrats had noticed it. The difficulty of concealing Biden's decline was such that the president's innermost circle shielded him from press scrutiny, kept his own cabinet at bay, and then scheduled can't-miss meetings with legislators during the periods of time throughout the day at which he was the sharpest. Now, she was the press secretary, and she didn't notice any of this? It's frankly unbelievable, unless she was unusually out of the loop. She certainly isn't claiming she was out of the loop, however, so one wonders then why she would bother telling her story in book format and discussing it on national television if she cannot honestly reckon with these incredible shortcomings. Now, she says she's become an independent. She no longer identifies as a Democrat, mostly because, it seems, she doesn't like how the Democratic Party treated Joe Biden. I guess she thinks they should have stuck by their man and lost even worse to Donald Trump. Again, it's hard to take any of this seriously, and she basically seems like she's performing a stunt. aimed at, I guess, selling books, if she's selling books. But if she's not going to grapple honestly with how she could have missed what many of you did not, even from a much greater distance, then I'm not sure why we should care what she has to say. And I'm sorry if that sounds harsh, but she was the primary comms person for a president who had lost the ability to coherently speak for himself. And I think, Lindsay, that she is just really kind of lost here, but am I being too hard on her?
Well, I just want to start with the positive news.
Okay.
I think it's honorable that she is, being so loyal to President Biden. She was his former President Biden. She was his, like you said, communications head for a long time, stayed with him, as she said in the CBS interview, 95% of the time, spent a ton of time with him. And now as he's battling cancer and, going through his experience of these later chapter of his life, to continue to pile on is not, to me, like I've consistently said, the best strategy for her. Now, selling books and not answering the real questions, maybe the timing is off, maybe wait a year when it dies down a little bit. But I just think that's honorable and set to the side. But like I said about Kamala coming out with her book or Karine Jean-Pierre, a lot of this consistent dialogue from all people of the Democratic Party was that democracy was at stake if President Trump won again. And so to hear her say that she couldn't believe and to read quotes from her book about George Clooney speaking up and saying that Biden should not run. And Nancy Pelosi, she couldn't believe it, that they asked Biden to drop out, whether in secret or publicly. I just don't understand why we would continue to push forward when leaders of the party, big donors of the party, are saying this is not the best move forward. She said she didn't think that Kamala had the capacity to win the election, not because of Kamala not being sharp or smart enough, because she didn't think America was progressive enough to elect a woman of color president. And that's why she thought that was a mistake to switch gears. But tell me, if you were next to him and the debate was extremely a surprise, but then Jake Tapper's book tells us that Jill Biden was wholly protecting Biden and kind of keeping people away from him. But then you describe in many interviews Jill Biden as somewhat of a mentor figure to you. How can you, make it all make sense to us? And that's the biggest thing for me, is that people just want to understand your perspective. If you're going to be honest and real and raw and leave the party, fine. But people are looking for guidance right now, particularly in the Democratic Party after losing an election and seeing where we're at, literally at a stalemate with a government shutdown because of something that Democrats are requesting. What is the way forward? You're just leaving the party because of what a majority of people felt, discouraged by Joe Biden's leadership. I don't think that that's a good strategy. A lot of people are leaving the party because they felt let down by the fact that Joe Biden kept going forward.
For the opposite reason she is. She's leaving the party because it was not loyal enough to Joe Biden. I mean, that's a constituency of one. That's just her. She's the only one in the entire country who feels that way.
And that's why I think she's looking at it like, a close family friend that gets older and not like a realistic, this is policy and politics.
She is, I guess she is loyal, and maybe that's a good thing. I think this level of loyalty being shown to Donald Trump would be not something that liberal commentators would say.
I call out that all the time, so I'll take that criticism.
Yeah.
I do call that out often, that people are being too loyal to President.
I wish people would speak up. If you see something, say something, like they advise us on the metro and at the airport.
But there's no need to even kick Biden while she's down. She wants to write a book and tell her story. I don't see the necessity of her to kick Biden while he's in this moment.
I shall kick.
This is what we disagree on.
Yep, I shall kick.